May 2, 2026. The moment this news broke, it changed the entire direction of the Iran nuclear story, and almost no one is explaining why. Early this morning, reports confirmed that Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, arrived in St. Petersburg for a high-stakes meeting with Vladimir Putin. Within hours, the Kremlin, through spokesman Dmitry Peskov, made one thing unmistakably clear. Russia's offer to take custody of Iran's enriched uranium is still on the table. Not a rumor, not speculation, not diplomatic theater. A standing, active proposal. And then came the line that should stop every serious observer in their tracks. It has not been acted upon. 4 simple words, but they expose a geopolitical standoff far bigger than most headlines suggest. Because beneath the surface, this has never been just about uranium. It has been about control, leverage, and who gets to shape the next balance of power in the Middle East. For months, the United States has repeated one central demand in every negotiation, every indirect message, every diplomatic signal. Iran must get rid of its enriched uranium. Not reduce it, not freeze it, not temporarily cap it, remove it. We are talking about roughly 450 kilograms enriched to 60% purity, material that experts say could be pushed toward weapons-grade levels in a matter of weeks if further refined. That is enough material for multiple nuclear weapons. So this is not one condition among many. This is the condition. Every ceasefire discussion, every sanctions debate, every quiet diplomatic contact ultimately circles back to this same non-negotiable requirement. And then, suddenly, Russia steps in with what appears, at least on paper, to be the perfect solution. Moscow is essentially saying, give us the uranium. We will remove it from Iranian territory. We will store it on Russian soil. We will reprocess it under international supervision. Iran keeps its civilian nuclear infrastructure. The dangerous stockpile leaves the country. The International Atomic Energy Agency can monitor the process. The immediate risk of escalation drops dramatically. No airstrikes, no military showdown, no regional spiral into war. A diplomatic off-ramp. But here is the twist, and it is the part no one can ignore. The proposal that appears to satisfy every major requirement was not accepted. And that raises the real question driving this entire story. If a workable solution exists that removes the material, reduces the risk of conflict, and stabilizes the region, why was it turned down? Let me state this clearly, because too much coverage is avoiding the obvious. According to reports, including Axios citing US officials, Washington has not accepted Putin's offer for Russia to take custody of Iran's enriched uranium. On the surface, the American position sounds straightforward. We need to see the uranium secured. But that phrase hides the deeper conflict. The United States appears to agree with the objective, but not the mechanism. They want the uranium out of Iran. They just do not want it placed in Russian hands. And that distinction, small on paper, enormous in reality, is the center of the entire crisis. Because once you understand that, everything else begins to make sense. While Washington hesitates, Abbas Araghchi boards a plane and flies directly to St. Petersburg to meet Putin. That is not a routine diplomatic visit. That is a signal. A signal that Iran may be saying, if America refuses a Russian-mediated solution, then we will speak with Russia directly anyway. And if that is true, this story is no longer only about Iran's nuclear stockpile. It becomes a contest over who has the authority to solve global crises in 2026, Washington or Moscow.
That was not a routine diplomatic visit. It was a signal. Iran was effectively responding with a message that could not be clearer. If America will not accept Russia as the solution, then we will speak to Russia directly anyway. And to understand why this moment matters so much, you have to go back, not months, but years, to the foundation of this entire dispute. Under the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the nuclear agreement that Donald Trump withdrew from in 2018, Russia was already playing this exact role. Iran shipped out roughly 97% of its enriched uranium stockpile, And where did much of it go? To Russia. It was handled through Russian nuclear infrastructure, including Rosatom, where the material was stored, processed, and monitored under international oversight. And here is the point many people forget. That system worked. There were no major violations, no known diversion of material, no collapse in the verification process. The International Atomic Energy Agency repeatedly verified compliance. For years, the arrangement functioned as designed, until the United States exited the agreement and reimposed sanctions. So when Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov says today that Russia is the only country with positive experience handling Iran's uranium, he is not merely promoting Moscow's role. He is referring to a documented precedent. This is not a theoretical proposal. It is a revival of a mechanism that already succeeded once before. Russia still has the infrastructure. It has the technical capability. It has storage capacity. It has existing working channels with the IAEA. And according to multiple assessments, the transfer could be organized again relatively quickly if political approval existed. So technically, diplomatically, and historically, a pathway is sitting right in front of everyone. Russia is ready. Iran is engaging. The IAEA could supervise. Everything appears aligned. Which brings us to the real question, the uncomfortable one many Western discussions prefer to avoid. Why reject it? The answer may have less to do with uranium itself and more to do with power. Washington's concern, based on public reporting, is that allowing Russia to take and process Iran's uranium would strengthen Moscow's position in the global nuclear energy market. Russia, through Rosatom and related networks, already holds a major share of uranium enrichment services and nuclear fuel supply chains. If Moscow receives Iran's stockpile, processes it, and potentially reintroduces portions into civilian fuel markets under legal frameworks that could expand Russian leverage across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. For the United States, which has spent years trying to reduce international dependence on Russian nuclear services, that would be a strategic setback. And to be fair, that concern is not irrational. It is a coherent geopolitical calculation. But every strategic calculation carries a cost. And this one may be substantial. By rejecting Russia as custodian, Washington is effectively demanding that Iran surrender its uranium through another channel, one that does not empower Moscow. The problem is that those channels are extremely limited. Iran is highly unlikely to transfer strategic nuclear material directly to the United States. It is equally unlikely to place full trust in U.S.-aligned states such as France or Japan. And the idea of destroying the stockpile inside Iran would require a level of transparency, cooperation, and mutual confidence that simply does not exist today. So what remains is a paradox. The United States wants the uranium gone. Russia offers a previously tested method to remove it. Iran appears willing to discuss it. But because of who controls the solution, rather than what the solution achieves, progress stalls. And that is exactly why today's meeting in St. Petersburg matters far more than it appears. Because where does this leave Washington now? In a more constrained position than many assume. By rejecting Putin's uranium proposal, the United States may have boxed itself into a corner. The only mechanism with a proven track record has been set aside. And while officials search for an alternative that does not yet clearly exist, one fact remains unchanged. Iran's enriched uranium stays inside Iran. That means the pressure campaign continues. Regional uncertainty continues. Energy markets remain sensitive. And Iran understands all of it. Tehran knows Washington rejected the Russian channel. It knows no ready substitute has emerged. And most importantly, it knows that without resolving the uranium issue, the United States cannot fully close this crisis on its own terms. That is why Abbas Araghchi's flight to St. Petersburg was not merely diplomacy. It was leverage. And in geopolitics, leverage often matters more than headlines. So instead of waiting for Washington to decide, Iran appears to be leaning into the one channel that still remains open: Russia. And then Abbas Araghchi adds another layer to the story when he speaks to Iranian state media. He describes the trip as a good opportunity for consultations with Moscow and emphasizes that those discussions are especially important at this stage. That phrase matters. At this stage signals urgency. It signals timing. It signals leverage. It tells you this is not routine diplomatic coordination or a ceremonial visit. It suggests a moment in which the balance of influence may be shifting. Talks remain stalled. Washington appears hesitant. The uranium question is unresolved. And in that vacuum, Russia's relevance does not diminish. It grows. Because as Dmitry Peskov publicly confirmed, the offer still exists. The mechanism remains available. And by physically showing up in Russia, Iran is sending a message without saying it directly. The solution is there. It is operational. It is waiting. The United States chose not to use it. At the same time, Tehran may also be preparing for another possibility. If Washington eventually changes course, or if pressure builds from global markets, regional allies, or countries dependent on stability in choke points like the Strait of Hormuz, Iran wants the architecture of a deal already in place and ready to move. Now add China to this equation, because what Beijing is not saying may be just as important as what Moscow is saying. Before Araghchi boarded his flight, he reportedly spoke with Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi. That contact came before consultations with several other regional actors. Whether symbolic or substantive, it suggests China had early visibility into Iran's diplomatic thinking before key developments became public. And yet today, China has remained notably quiet. No major statement on the visit, no public endorsement of the uranium proposal, no overt positioning. But silence should not be confused with irrelevance. China's relationship with Iran runs deep through energy ties, trade links, infrastructure agreements, and years of strategic coordination. Beijing has strong incentives to preserve regional stability, secure energy flows, and avoid a wider conflict that disrupts global markets. Just days ago, China and Russia reportedly held discussions with the International Atomic Energy Agency regarding Iran's nuclear file. That sequence is notable. First, consultations, then diplomatic movement, then a high-level meeting in St. Petersburg. Whether formally coordinated or not, it indicates active engagement by major powers before public headlines fully caught up. So what you may be seeing is a layered process. An earlier phase focused on positioning and technical dialogue. Today's phase focused on execution and leverage. And China remains in the background, watching from a position of quiet influence. Because Beijing already holds long-term energy ties with Iran and has economic tools to shape outcomes without needing dramatic public statements. Which brings us back to the structural problem facing the United States. This is not merely a diplomatic disagreement. It is a strategic dilemma. Washington wants Iran's uranium removed. Russia has the capability and prior experience to help remove it. The United States has not accepted that route, and at this moment, no clearly viable alternative appears acceptable to all sides. That leaves difficult choices. Reconsider a Russian-backed mechanism, or move toward far riskier coercive options. There have long been discussions in policy circles about scenarios involving direct operations to secure or neutralize nuclear material inside Iran. But think carefully about what that would mean. That would not be a diplomatic breakthrough. It would be a military escalation. It could undermine any ceasefire framework, require highly complex coordination, and risk triggering responses from Tehran that expand the crisis in unpredictable ways. It is a path full of variables no one can fully control. So this is the reality right now, as Araghchi sits across from Putin in St. Petersburg. The clearest peaceful mechanism currently discussed for removing Iran's uranium is the one offered by Russia and not accepted by Washington. The alternatives are harder, riskier, and far less certain. Meanwhile, conditions continue to tighten. Maritime tensions remain elevated. Economic pressure persists. And the diplomatic window many hoped would widen during a ceasefire may instead be narrowing. Now here is where the situation becomes difficult to ignore. Donald Trump previously described the uranium issue as representing 99% of the deal. Others in his orbit echoed the same framing. If the uranium question represents nearly the entire agreement, and the most workable mechanism for resolving it remains blocked, then the core pathway itself is obstructed. That is not a minor setback. That is the center of the process. And that may explain why Abbas Araghchi is in St. Petersburg today. This meeting may not be about deciding whether Russia could take the uranium. It may be about everything that comes after that. The timeline, the IAEA monitoring structure, the technical safeguards, the legal guarantees, and the protections preventing any side from converting the arrangement into broader strategic leverage. And here is the key point. Those are difficult problems, but they are solvable problems. They are not the same as an unsolvable geopolitical dead end. They are engineering, legal, and regulatory questions. In principle, they can be negotiated, structured, and enforced. And that is why Iran is in Russia right now, because the bigger strategic question may already be partially settled in practice. Russia is willing. Iran is open to it. The IAEA has the technical capacity to supervise it. So the only missing piece in this equation is political. A clear yes from Washington. Now, to be fair, there is a serious counter-argument, and it needs to be stated directly, not glossed over. The concern in Washington is not about whether the mechanism works on paper, it is about what it does politically if it is implemented. Vladimir Putin is not offering to take Iran's enriched uranium as a neutral mediator or as an act of goodwill toward the international system. Russia is acting within a competitive geopolitical environment. If Moscow takes custody of this material, it strengthens Russia's position in the global nuclear fuel cycle. It increases its leverage in energy diplomacy. It deepens its role in any post-conflict security architecture in the Middle East. From Washington's perspective, that is not a side effect. It is the core concern. And that skepticism is not irrational. It reflects a long-running strategic competition between the United States and Russia that extends far beyond Iran. But the critical question is not whether Russia benefits. The real question is whether rejecting this pathway produces a better outcome. Because the alternative we are seeing in real time is not stability. A ceasefire that exists more in diplomatic language than in operational reality. Rising pressure in key maritime corridors like the Strait of Hormuz. Volatile energy markets that respond to every escalation. And most importantly, Iran's enriched uranium remaining inside Iranian territory, unchanged and unresolved. When measured against those outcomes, the cost of rejecting the Russian mechanism becomes more visible. That is the calculation that has been made, and so far, it has not produced agreement. Which is exactly why Abbas Araghchi is in St. Petersburg today, while Washington continues to wait for an alternative framework that has not yet materialized. Now, looking forward, the next phase of this process is likely to move from concept to detail. Behind closed doors, Russia is expected to refine its proposal into a more structured framework, less political signaling, more technical architecture. That would likely include clear timelines for uranium transfer, defined storage and security conditions, formal International Atomic Energy Agency monitoring, and strict limits on how the material could be processed or reintroduced into any nuclear fuel cycle. That final element is central to Washington's objections, the fear that Russia could convert custody into long-term strategic leverage. If binding constraints are added, if the proposal includes verifiable restrictions that prevent unilateral economic or political use of the material, then the most sensitive part of the U.S. concern is at least partially addressed. From there, the process becomes procedural rather than abstract. Araghchi would take the framework back to Tehran. Regional intermediaries would review it. It would return to Washington through diplomatic channels. And at that point, the decision becomes binary. Accept the mechanism or reject it again. If accepted, the implications are immediate. The uranium issue, the part repeatedly described as 99% of the deal, would be effectively resolved. Pressure on maritime choke points could ease. Energy markets could stabilize. The diplomatic track toward de-escalation would reopen. If rejected again, the consequences are equally clear. Continued stagnation, continued escalation risk, and a growing record that each side will interpret differently. Iran signaled willingness. Russia proposed a mechanism. The United States declined. And repetition of that pattern changes the diplomatic narrative over time. China, meanwhile, remains in a different posture entirely. Publicly, Beijing is quiet. No statements, no direct positioning on today's meeting, no visible pressure. But that silence is not absence. China continues to purchase Iranian energy exports, providing Tehran with economic stability. It is already engaged with Russia and the IAEA on aspects of Iran's nuclear file, and it maintains long-term strategic ties that give it influence without requiring public confrontation. In practice, China operates as a stabilizing background actor present in the system, even when not visible in the headlines. That environment matters because it gives Iran the strategic space to continue engaging Russia rather than immediately defaulting to U.S. terms. Which brings us back to a simple but revealing image. There is a diplomatic channel available, but instead of Washington driving the process, Araghchi is sitting across from Putin in St. Petersburg, discussing how that channel might actually function in practice. Now, there is one more layer to this that is often overlooked, and it gives the current moment its deeper strategic context. In January 2025, just weeks before tensions escalated further, Iran and Russia signed a 20-year strategic partnership agreement. This was not symbolic. It was a broad, structured framework covering economic cooperation, energy coordination, defense-related collaboration, and long-term political alignment. It did not establish a formal mutual defense treaty, but it did significantly deepen institutional ties between the two states. And that matters because it means today's discussions are not happening in isolation. They are occurring inside an already existing strategic framework, one that both sides have spent years building, and one that now shapes how this uranium question is being approached at the highest level.
When Abbas Araghchi lands in St. Petersburg to meet Vladimir Putin, he is not walking into a room as a negotiator seeking outside help. He is arriving as a representative of a treaty partner, coordinating strategy with a state that is already embedded in Iran's long-term strategic framework. That distinction matters because it changes how this meeting is interpreted. This is not Russia stepping in as a neutral mediator. It is Russia engaging with a partner inside an existing geopolitical alignment, one shaped by years of energy coordination, sanctions pressure, and expanding security cooperation. So the discussion behind closed doors is not only about whether Russia can help resolve the uranium issue, it is about how both sides position themselves inside a wider geopolitical contest, and what each stands to gain depending on how that contest evolves. Because Russia's interests here are not abstract, they are measurable. During periods of heightened tension in the region, particularly when instability near the Strait of Hormuz disrupts global shipping routes, energy markets tighten and prices rise. In those moments, Russia's export revenues increase significantly. In some periods, estimates have placed Moscow's daily energy earnings in the hundreds of millions of euros. That is not incidental. It is structural. It means instability elsewhere can translate into predictable gains for Russia's economy, which raises an important analytical question. What does Russia optimize for in a situation like this? A rapid stabilization that reduces volatility, or a prolonged period in which it remains both a beneficiary of elevated prices and a central diplomatic actor offering itself as the indispensable solution? This is not about assuming intent. It is about understanding incentives. Russia's position allows it to potentially benefit in multiple scenarios. If its proposal is accepted, it becomes a central custodian of Iranian nuclear material, expands its role in global nuclear fuel logistics, and gains diplomatic credit as a key broker in resolving a high-stakes crisis. If it is rejected, instability continues, and with it, elevated energy prices and sustained geopolitical relevance as Washington struggles to secure an alternative mechanism. China's posture operates in a similarly quiet but structurally important way. Beijing does not need to dominate headlines to influence outcomes. It continues purchasing Iranian energy, sustaining Tehran's fiscal resilience. It maintains strategic dialogue with both Russia and Iran, and engages with international institutions like the IAEA on nuclear governance discussions. The result is an environment in which Iran is not under immediate economic collapse pressure, and therefore not forced into rapid concessions. That reduces urgency for Tehran and increases negotiating time. So when Araghchi arrives in St. Petersburg, it is not just a bilateral meeting. It sits inside a broader system involving three overlapping dynamics. A Russian state that can both propose solutions and benefit from delay. A Chinese state that sustains Iran's economic baseline while remaining publicly quiet. And an American position that seeks a specific outcome but has not agreed on an accepted mechanism to achieve it. That is the structure underneath the headlines. And it explains why this moment is being treated as significant. Iran is not only discussing uranium with Russia, it is coordinating within an existing strategic environment shaped by long-term partnerships and shared incentives. At the center of it all is a simple but unresolved issue: the uranium stockpile and how it is removed, secured, or reprocessed under international oversight. From Washington's perspective, that issue represents the core of the broader agreement. It is often framed by multiple officials and political figures as the decisive component of any deal. If that is true, then control over the mechanism that resolves it becomes strategically decisive. And right now, that mechanism exists in one primary form: the Russian proposal. which leads to the central tension. Iran is engaging with the only available structured pathway that already exists. Russia is offering it. The IAEA has the technical capacity to monitor it, but the United States has not accepted it. So the gap is not between diplomacy and no diplomacy. It is between a proposed solution and political acceptance of that solution. That is why Araghchi's presence in Russia matters. It is not symbolic travel. It is an attempt to operationalize a pathway that already exists on paper but has not yet been politically endorsed. At the same time, Iran has pursued parallel diplomatic channels. Through intermediaries, including Pakistan, Tehran has floated proposals aimed at reducing immediate pressure in other domains, particularly maritime stability in the Strait of Hormuz. The logic is straightforward. Reduce short-term escalation risk while leaving the nuclear issue to a separate, structured negotiation track. In effect, this creates a dual-track strategy. One track focused on immediate de-escalation of regional tensions, another focused on longer-term resolution of the nuclear question through existing technical mechanisms. Viewed together, these are not separate initiatives. They form a coordinated approach, easing pressure where possible while preserving leverage where necessary. But neither track advances without reciprocal movement from the United States. And that is where the current deadlock emerges. Because while Iran is presenting options, immediate stabilization on one hand, structured uranium custody on the other, Washington has not yet committed to either framework. So the system enters a holding pattern. Russia remains positioned with an available mechanism. China remains economically supportive, but publicly restrained. Iran remains engaged across multiple channels, and the United States remains in a position of strategic evaluation without final acceptance. That is the structural reality beneath the diplomacy. It is not a single negotiation failing. It is a multi-layered system where each actor is optimizing for different outcomes, and where available solutions exist but are not collectively activated. And that is why this meeting in St. Petersburg is being watched closely. Not because it is a breakthrough by itself, but because it reveals something more fundamental. The solution set is known, partially built, and already on the table. What remains unresolved is not engineering. It is agreement.